What if Invincible replaced Deku as the main character in My Hero Academia and attended UA High School? What would his quirk be? Would he still get one for all? And would it affect All for One's plan for world domination? I'm about to lay out the entire story without any spoilers for the manga or the comics. But first, we need to clarify a few things. Up top, Mark is replacing Midoriya. In this version of events, Mark will be living in Japan with his mother, Debbie. She moved here to continue her real estate work instead of America. Also, Mark's father is in the story just as much as Deku's father, so not even a little bit. Omni-Man was a very powerful and famous American hero, but he had to leave on some Viltrumite business several years ago. Mark and Debbie have not heard from him since. Secondly, for the purpose of this story, Mark is a human with a quirk. His mother is quirkless, but his father passed on the one quirk that all Viltrumites share: smart atoms. If you're not familiar, Viltrumites have super strength, durability, and flight, all because they're able to control their atoms and how they react to the environment. A Viltrumite can force the atoms of his muscles to act like they're under normal stress while they're actually lifting thousands of pounds, or act as though they're pressing against a solid surface even though they're mid-air. That's how they fly. With that, I think we're all set. Strap in, get comfy, you are about to see what would happen if Invincible attended My Hero Academia. As our story begins, it's not dissimilar to Deku's beginning. Mark had always been quirkless, just like his mother, his Viltrumite powers not manifesting at a young age like everyone else's quirks. It wasn't until middle school, when Mark was taking out the trash for his mom, that his quirk finally manifested, launching the trash bag into the sky. Of course, he was overjoyed, immediately spending the night testing out his newfound strength and durability. Unfortunately, he could not figure out how to fly. He knew his father could fly, but Omni-Man wasn't here to help Mark work through his powers. And as supportive as his mom was, Debbie didn't have any insight on how to use a quirk. Still, even without flight, this Smart Atoms quirk was incredibly strong. So when Mark went to school the next day and ran into the notorious bully, Katsuki Bakugo, he was more than ready to snap as Bakugo told him, "Take a swan dive off the roof because you're a useless, quirkless loser." A lot like Deku, Mark has a fundamentally kind heart, but he's not a pushover, and he has a mischievous streak. So, even though Mark wanted to punch Bakugo in the jaw and send him flying down the block, he made a different choice. He climbed up to the roof and loudly proclaimed he was going to jump just as Bakugo told him to. You can imagine the stunned and terrified look on Katsuki's face when Mark landed on both feet completely unharmed as the concrete cracked beneath him. Almost immediately, Mark Grayson was shifted from quirkless outcast to the new golden boy of his grade, something that deeply aggravated Bakugo. But their rivalry was only beginning. It would get much worse at UA, the prestigious hero high school they both applied for. Because Mark's Smart Atom quirk is natural to his body, the intense super strength it provides makes him far more formidable than Deku ever was during the entrance exams. He passes with flying colors, destroying dozens of robots and even tackling the giant no-points machine just for fun. He gets a few hits in, it gets a few hits in, but he manages to topple it without much trouble. Mark is accepted into UA as a part of Class 1A. At this point, Mark meets the teachers as well as the other students. Mark is introduced to All Might for the very first time here at school, and it would be a short interaction. All Might would tell Mark that he's extremely promising and that he'll be following his studies closely. See, at this point in the series, we know All Might had been keeping his eye on Mirio for a while, as a potential wielder of One for All, and only changed his mind after the fateful meeting with Deku. Because Deku doesn't exist here, All Might hasn't passed on One for All, isn't coasting on embers, and is still evaluating Mirio. But Mark's tremendous power has caught his attention as well. The other teachers aren't of much consequence. Aizawa is very critical of Mark's inability to fly, but otherwise is supportive. Mark may need to worry about Midnight, but honestly, she's way less of a threat than Anissa, so he'll be fine. As for the students, Deku befriended Ida and Uraraka at first. But I think Mark would probably be extremely popular here. He's much more social and confident than Deku, though his closest friends would likely end up being Kirishima, Kaminari, Seto, and Ashido. Bakugo does make it into 1A, and the other students try to befriend him, but he's even more standoffish than in the original series. Mark's stunt at their middle school lit a fire underneath him, which leads us into the students' first battle trial. Mark gets his hero suit just in time to fight against Bakugo, who's looking to settle the score and prove himself as the superior student with a superior quirk. Unfortunately for Bakugo, this goes even worse than his first fight against Deku. Mark doesn't try to evade Bakugo or even outmaneuver him. He takes his explosions square to the face, smiling through them, just to land several devastating punches. Mark gets pretty scorched. The explosions are enough to burn him, but not much else. Bakugo, on the other hand, gets a broken nose and a few shattered ribs. Things are looking like they're about to get a lot bloodier, but the match is called off early by the teachers. Bakugo screams about continuing the fight, but Mark is more than happy with this result. He got to beat up his childhood bully and score points for it. It's at this point that Mark moves past any hangups he had about Bakugo, but Bakugo doubles down. He will find a way to crush Mark Grayson no matter what. His grades start to suffer, and he spends all of his time alone training his quirk. From here, we move on to the rescue simulation training, where the League of Villains attacks the students for the first time. Shigaraki sneaks into the training arena along with a group of criminals, accompanied by Kurogiri and the shock absorption Nomu. Aizawa and 13 are on the scene to stall and try to protect the kids. It was at this point that Deku was paralyzed by indecision. The students were told not to interfere and to leave the fighting to the adults, so Ida left to go and get help. But Mark is less worried about getting in trouble. He has more of a rebellious streak. He chooses to help Aizawa fight off the criminals, which inspires several of the others in Class 1A to join him. These small fry villains are dispatched way sooner, even with Kurogiri trying to break the heroes up by teleporting them away to different sectors, because Bakugo manages to restrain him. Things are going very smoothly, which means unfortunately the Nomu chooses to intervene sooner before All Might arrives. The Nomu quickly takes out Todoroki, Kirishima, and Bakugo. It's about to crush the three of them when Mark steps in, catching its foot in his hands. Mark lands several punches on the monster, effortlessly. Each is absorbed. Shigaraki tries to decay Mark to save the Nomu's strength for All Might, but Mark is saved by Aizawa, who engages him instead. So Mark turns his attention back to the Nomu. See, one of Deku's greatest strengths is his intellect and encyclopedic knowledge of quirks, which he regularly uses to deduce weaknesses and craft strategies. Mark is not as intelligent as Deku, but they do have one thing in common. Mark is a huge comic book nerd. He would be very familiar with all of the pros and famous villains, their moves, their weaknesses, and quickly adapt to new powers as he sees them. This is why, after seeing just how dangerous the Nomu is and how it absorbs kinetic force, Mark doesn't just punch it really hard like you would expect a shonen protagonist to do. He grabs it by the leg and, swinging around as hard as he possibly can, throws the beast up into the air. It smashes through the ceiling and goes flying into the sky, far away from the students. Just then, All Might arrives. Now, with his greatest weapon completely ruined, Shigaraki retreats. He and Kurogiri run away with their tails between their legs. This is, by all accounts, an absolute victory. Everyone is safe, All Might didn't even need to fight, and now everyone has Mark in their minds as a true hero. But unfortunately, there will be consequences. The special Nomu made to kill All Might never even reached him. This catches the attention of the man behind the plan, All for One. The notorious, legendary villain has been around for hundreds of years, and though he never got a good look at Omni-Man in person, he always had an assumption that his quirk might be even more powerful than 8 generations of One for All. And now that Omni-Man's supposedly quirkless son is showcasing power on that level, it might be time to shift the scope of his plans. He'll be watching Mark closely, and Mark is about to be in front of a bunch of cameras. It's time for the sports festival. Hey, real quick, are you enjoying this video? Yeah? Well, why haven't you liked it yet? Or subscribed? How else am I gonna know? I mean, I guess you could follow me on Twitter, link in the description, and then tell me there how much you're loving it, but just to be safe, you should probably do all 3. Oh, and also leave a comment too. Yeah, you know what? I agree. That was a really good idea that you just had. You should definitely do all of those things. And hey, I'd love to keep talking to you about all these great ideas that you keep having, but I have a video to get back to, so if you don't mind, cool. Thanks. As you might expect, the Smart Adam's quirk is just too busted. At the sports festival, Mark excels in the opening race and capture the flag competitions, and even sweeps through the combat rounds. He is pitted up against Todoroki in the quarterfinals, who puts up a valiant effort with his ice, but Mark is able to easily break free anytime he's frozen, and rings out Shoto without much difficulty. Because he's not Deku, Mark doesn't think it's his place to convince Todoroki to use his fire, but after the match, he does give an encouraging word, asking to fight him again, and Todoroki seems receptive. This leads us up to the finals, Mark versus Bakugo. Mark wants a clean match, but Bakugo is out for blood. Originally, this was when he debuted the Howitzer Impact, but remember, Bakugo has been shirking his classes, spending all his time training. When the match begins, Bakugo starts off with the deadliest move he can muster, his newly discovered AP shot, designed for boring holes in concrete. This super concentrated burst of energy catches Mark completely off guard, burning a hole right through his shoulder. Bakugo quickly capitalizes on his pain and confusion, blasting another hole through his thigh, then following it up with a Howitzer Impact to the face. Mark is blasted into the concrete by the tremendous force, his uniform scorched by the fire raining down on him. It's at this point, with a disabled arm and leg, as well as a clear concussion, that any other student would pass out. But Mark, unbeknownst to himself and everyone there, is a descendant of the Viltrumites. They were bred for war. Just like Mark's fight against Battle Beast in Invincible Season 1, Mark sees red for the first time in his life and flies into a rage. Dragging himself up from the rubble, he lands a kick, shattering Bakugo's leg. Before he can hit the ground, Mark follows it up with a barrage of punches, all of his pent-up rage from years of bullying finally released. He screams, "This is what you wanted, right?" as Bakugo is launched from the ring, landing on the grass in a bloody daze. But even though he already won, Mark is still in the heat of battle. He rushes forward to keep attacking the clearly broken Bakugo. He lands several more punches on Bakugo's unconscious body, but luckily he's stopped as Midnight releases her sleeping gas over the arena. As Mark is pulled out of a rage and into sleep, he takes a look at the blood on his hands. "I thought you were stronger." He passes out. When Mark awakens, luckily he has been healed for the first time by Recovery Girl. He looks over to the adjacent gurney where Bakugo should be, but he left as soon as he was healed and is nowhere to be found. Odd. He also doesn't attend the awards ceremony, so while Mark takes first place and Todoroki takes third, there is no second place medal awarded. Mark pushes through all the pros reaching out to him, offering internships, until he finds Bakugo sulking outside the stadium. He tries to apologize for being so brutal, but Bakugo stops him. Unfortunately, it's not because he's had a change of heart. Bakugo says it plainly. Mark is a freak of nature. He is a genetic anomaly, not in the same league as anyone else. But that fits. Mark has always been an outsider. Whether he's below everyone as a quirkless loser or above everyone as a monster, it doesn't matter. He will never have a place among those people as a hero. They're just going to fear him. These are the most cutting words Bakugo can muster, and they clearly have an effect on Mark, who just walks away. The UA teachers sense the bad blood between Mark and Bakugo, so the two are paired up to fight All Might during their exams. But Bakugo refuses to participate with Mark, so Mark fights All Might on his own. All Might wants to prepare these boys for the reality of dangerous villains and pushes him hard, but everything he dishes out, Mark can take. Mark does so well that All Might starts to get serious, throwing out punches at more than half his power. And as Mark takes the blows, he starts to get serious, the bloodlust he experienced during the sports festival making a return. He strikes All Might, launching him through several buildings and shaking the entire arena. Seeing this immense power, All Might calls off the exam halfway through. Wary of the damage the two of them might cause if they continue, he is astonished, and after calming Mark down, he offers to tutor him privately. He has incredible potential, but needs to learn to temper his battle rage. Mark agrees that it's an issue, but he says he'll think about it. There's a small part of him hoping his father will return to teach him one day soon. He misses his dad. Just as Mark has decided to continue having hope, he makes his way back to the rest of the class, to see all the other students are staring at him in fear. After the battle with Bakugo and now seeing Mark fight All Might to a standstill, flying into a rage again, Mark doesn't seem like their friend anymore. He's almost like a monster. After spending life as a quirkless loser, Mark has inherited the most powerful quirk in the world, only to find himself an outcast once again. When it's time for 1A to pick their hero names, they all choose the ones you're familiar with, and Mark decides to go with... Mark chooses the name Invincible because he wants people to think of him as someone who never gives up, as opposed to a bloodthirsty brawler. He tries to talk with Kirishima and Kaminari, and they explain their fears. They don't think Mark would ever choose to hurt them, but when he fights, it looks like he's not really in control, and with how strong he is... Kirishima tries to snap himself out of it. Hey, I guess I'll just have to get so tough that I'll never have to worry about my buddy Mark flying off the handle. And that relationship starts to heal a little bit, before Bakugo butts in, saying that Mark will never be normal, and it would be best to ignore him. That's what he's decided to do. Kirishima tries to stick up for him, but Mark stops him. Maybe Bakugo is right. As we move on to the summer training camp, Mark has accepted All Might's tutoring. They focus primarily on tempering his rage, helping him stay calm and focused when in the heat of battle. And after a few sessions, they start to make some real progress. Mark is almost as strong as Prime All Might before he fought All for One, and he's getting stronger. Not to mention, he's learned to keep a calm mind, All Might pushing him to his limit and helping him stay there without flying off the handle. They also talk about why Mark wants to be a hero. He's excited about being a force for good in the world, and wants to live up to the hero his father was. After a few days, All Might is confident in Mark's ability to control himself, and has to take care of some pro-hero work. He leaves Mark to work on learning to fly, like his father could. But Mark doesn't make it very far in his flight training. The day after All Might leaves the training camp, this is when the League of Villains attack once again. They prey on the students, attempting to kidnap Bakugo, but Mark doesn't run into Muscular alone like Deku did. Instead, Mark hears the commotion and rushes back to camp. He sees Bakugo being restrained, and as he tries to intervene, Muscular attacks him directly. Mark is more than a match for Muscular, but he can't focus on the fight because he's trying to prevent Bakugo from being taken. Just as he's about to grab him from Kurogiri's clutches, Mark is pulled away by Magni and gassed by Mustard. It was a trap. They're ganging up on him. He tries to keep fighting, but Muscular crushes his arm and Mark passes out. As it turns out, the League of Villains weren't trying to kidnap Bakugo at all. He was their bait, preying on Mark's good nature. They've kidnapped Invincible. Mark wakes up strapped to a table. His arm is broken and his body can't move because of a paralyzing quirk, currently being used on him by All for One. The legendary villain steps out of the shadows. He asks if Mark wants to join the League of Villains, if he'd like to be his protege. We can see that Shigaraki is here, sulking in the corner. With Mark, All for One has a new favorite to replace him, depending on how Mark responds here and now. Predictably, Mark tells the villains to shove it, but then All for One pries a little deeper. Do you really think you'll be able to control it? This rage? That anger that everyone who tries to get in your way? That anger at those who try to hurt you? That anger at your father for abandoning you, quirkless and alone? You'll give in one day, and then everyone will fear you. It's only a matter of time. Why not embrace it? Mark doesn't have a response. It's then that All Might smashes in along with the other pro heroes like Kamui Woods, Mount Lady, and Edgeshot. All for One makes his escape, taking Mark with him. They appear a few blocks away and All for One apologizes. He hoped they'd have more time or that Mark would join him willingly. Oh well, All for One stabs Mark and steals his Smart Adam's quirk. Mark is now quirkless. It's then that All Might arrives, tearing Mark away from All for One, but he doesn't have time to get him to safety. All for One is now immensely powerful, and All Might is fighting completely defensively. Luckily, this is when Bakugo arrives, joined by Kirishima, Kaminari, Ida, and Yaoyorozu. The 5 students are able to create a distraction and swoop in fast enough to snatch Mark and fly him to safety. Bakugo decided this was his chance to win some shine back by saving the oh-so-great. And besides, that's what heroes do, save the quirkless losers. Mark has nothing to say to him. The others are far more concerned for Mark and his safety, but they don't have time to talk. The battle between All Might and All for One is being televised. This battle is far more climactic than the original. All for One has the Smart Adam's quirk, the power of a Viltrumite on top of all of his other stolen quirks. And All Might has not yet passed on One for All, so he may be weaker than his prime maximum, but he's not running on embers. Because of this, the fight lasts a lot longer, both of these titans clashing with incredible strength. All Might is clearly losing. Luckily, his increased stamina is just what he needed, stalling long enough for other major pro heroes to arrive. Best Jeanist, Hawks, Mirko, Mount Lady, and Endeavor. None of them are powerful enough to defeat All for One, but together they more than wear down the villain's defenses, as he's totally fresh at using this new Viltrumite strength. Thanking them for the fun, All for One steals Mount Lady's quirk and makes his getaway. All Might, exhausted, collapses into a heap, his weakened form exposed to the world for the first time. No one died, but this was a total loss. After seeing everything that happened, all because he was kidnapped, Mark goes to be alone. Not long after, Momo comes to talk to him. As a short tangent, Mark was very popular at UA, and just like in Invincible, I think it's pretty likely he would try to get a girlfriend. He has pretty good chemistry with Kendo of Class 1B. She's very no-nonsense and has a strong sense of justice. She's actually a lot like Mark's first girlfriend, Amber. But I think Mark would get along better with Yaoyorozu. She comes from a very wealthy family and has a highly valued quirk, but she also struggles a lot with living up to the huge expectations put upon her. Mark has a very similar situation trying to live up to the example set by Omni-Man. Momo and Mark would likely bond over this shared experience. Also, funny coincidence, Cready's powers are most similar to Adam Eve's, but also, ships never go anywhere in My Hero Academia, so this really isn't that important. The point is, Momo is here for Mark. She would understand his experience with great expectations and his public failure. It's not unlike her loss to Tokoyami at the sports festival. She would try to reassure him that regardless of how hopeless the situation may seem, giving up will never make it any better. And this is when their conversation is interrupted by an EMT who's come to find them. All Might is awake, and he wants to talk to Mark. In his hospital bed, All Might explains his shrunken form to Mark. It is the result of an injury he sustained the last time he fought All for One. Because of it, he doesn't have much time left as a hero. From their short time together, All Might knows that Mark is a good kid with a strong drive to be a hero. He has seen All for One up close, and he has a personal stake in bringing him down. And finally, he's just been left without a quirk. So All Might offers a solution. Take his quirk. He explains One for All to Mark, how it's been forged over generations to take down All for One. Mark might be specifically equipped to handle its immense power, with how much strength his body regularly used due to his last quirk. But Mark isn't sure. He's devastated by the loss of his Smart Atoms, but now that he's powerless, people won't be afraid of him anymore. He's not sure what to do. So All Might offers him some advice. He saw Mark make great strides in his training to control himself in the heat of battle. But more than that, One for All is a very special quirk. A long time ago, All Might had a sidekick, Sir Night-Eye, who told him that he was destined to die a gruesome death if he continued as a hero. And tonight, he managed to survive. He can't confirm it, but All Might thinks that One for All might be strong enough to shape not only the world, but fate itself. He plucks a hair and holds it out to Mark. If you think you're destined for a future where people fear you, then grab a hold of that fate and change it. With that, Mark agrees, but he will not eat the hair right now. He's gonna slip it into a cheeseburger later. That night, Mark manifests One for All. Invincible is the 9th user. Because of his time spent using smart atoms, he's a far quicker study than Deku, able to use the full power of One for All in short bursts without his body coming apart. He trains regularly with All Might for just a few weeks, which is unfortunately all the time they have. Because All for One wasn't captured and sent to Tartarus, he's free to do as he pleases. And since Shigaraki doesn't have all that free time on his hands, he doesn't come to blows with Overhaul or the Paranormal Liberation Front. So no quirk rewinding bullets made from Ares' blood, and no quirk awakenings for the members of the League of Villains. Instead of focusing on giving Shigaraki an immortal body that he can later reincarnate into, All for One would be high on the incredible strength of Mark's quirk and alter his plans. He will start by toppling Hero Society and retrieving One for All. Then later he can worry about ruling over humanity as an immortal supervillain demon overlord. First things first, he wants his little brother's quirk back. It's clear that the Viltrumite instinct of conquest, it just might be weaseling its way into All for One's mind, but more on that later. All for One starts by breaking into Tartarus and releasing the villains into the streets. While the pros are distracted trying to prevent the collapse of society, All for One invades UA one final time. With everything advancing so much quicker, the UA faculty never discovers that Aoyama is the traitor, so All for One is easily able to slip inside the school to interrupt All Might and Mark mid-training, catching them both off guard. But on the plus side, the villains' forces are far weaker and less organized. They don't have any of Redestro's army, and Shigaraki doesn't have any of his crazy buffs. What follows is outright chaos. All the students and teachers of UA fending off the villains, while Invincible and All Might battle against the exceedingly powerful All for One. It's clear from the jump that All Might is the weakest of the three, mostly trying to act as a distraction while Mark gets in his punches. All for One is surprised. He wasn't expecting to see Invincible here, much less fight him. To think that the boy who gave him his new favorite quirk would also be the one to hand him his old favorite? It must be Providence. Mark manages to evade All for One reasonably well, but he only has the strength of One for All. Remember, the additional quirks like Black Whip and Float only awakened in Deku after he had the quirk for about half a year. Mark just inherited One for All a few weeks ago, and without Smokescreen or Danger Sense, even with All Might's help, Mark is continually on the back foot in this fight. Things look particularly dire. Once All for One finally manages to catch All Might, using Mount Lady's quirk to make his arm massive, he crushes the #1 hero in his fist, his bones cracking loud enough for Mark to hear. He is going to completely crush even his spine, but something goes wrong, and Mount Lady's quirk deactivates. All for One drops an unconscious All Might. Mark is confused and assumes Eraserhead is somewhere watching. Using the opportunity, Invincible lands several powerful blows, destroying All for One's mask, revealing his scarred face. Mark puts on quite a show, tearing down the villain, but it's not enough. All for One manages to land a solid punch and shatters Mark's right arm. He plunges the spears of All for One into Mark and steals away One for All. Mark tumbles back into the dirt. He fought hard. He did his best. But no matter what he tries, it always ends up the same. He's kneeling here, quirkless, unable to stop another bully. This is the end for him, for everyone. But, screw it. Mark stands up again. He doesn't have his father's strength. He doesn't have All Might's strength, but he is still invincible. People are watching, so he might as well go out like the hero he always wanted to be, the one he always fell short of being. Rushing forward, Mark punches All for One, the embers of One for All rippling through his one good arm. The villain laughs it off, grabbing him with Black Whip and flinging him away into some rubble. Mark stands and attacks again, this time blasted away with a concentrated wind quirk. Still, Mark gets up, now limping on a clearly injured leg. He tries to punch All for One again. This time, the villain is no longer entertained. He's trying to enjoy this. He just defeated All Might and attained both One for All and Omni-Man's quirk, and this brat keeps annoying him. He thanks Mark one more time for making all of his dreams come true, then prepares to wipe him off the face of the earth with an explosive fire quirk, boosted in strength by the power of One for All. His hand lights up in blazing flame, and Mark braces himself just as the fires sizzle out. What? All for One tries to activate Black Whip instead, but it fizzles away too. Something was happening to his quirks. As it turns out, All for One made a fatal mistake. Viltrumite blood is extremely pure. So pure that it essentially overrides any other DNA it comes into contact with. In a normal child-rearing process, this is never an issue, but when the quirk of a Viltrumite is introduced into a system with thousands of other unique quirks, it does as it's supposed to do, and overwrites them. When Mount Lady's quirk deactivated earlier, that was an Eraserhead. The quirk was destroyed. Mark's quirk is destroying All for One's stash of stolen quirks from the inside out. He starts to panic, trying to figure out a way to stop it, and then it begins to eat away at One for All, his greatest treasure. At this, Mark pipes up. "Oh gee, what a shame. If only there was someone nearby you could give the quirk to. You know, before it ruins your last 200 years of collecting." In a rage, All for One complies, but not without a price. He shatters Mark's other leg before placing the Smart Adam's quirk back into Mark. But there's no time to celebrate. All for One finally has the one quirk he's waited decades to retrieve, and the two people who could possibly oppose him are both lying crippled in the same ditch. It's time to say goodbye. He rises up into the sky and, using several of his remaining quirks, creates a gigantic ball of explosive energy. He yells down at the two heroes. "You have quite the ferocious quirk there, Mark Grayson. I see why people would fear it. Fear you! But don't worry, no one will ever fear the name Invincible again." Mark looks over to All Might and closes his eyes to concentrate. Everybody keeps talking about fear, but the only time I've ever been scary is when I'm scared. When I'm freaking out, worried that I'm gonna lose. But All for One, losing doesn't scare me anymore. Because you took everything from me, everything I ever wanted, and the sun still rose the next day. You taught me that. Thank you. Now, finally at peace with his own power, at peace with his place in the world, Mark experiences his first quirk awakening. His Smart Atoms push, creating their own leverage. And even with two broken legs, Invincible rockets up into the sky. Flying at full speed, he catches All for One off guard, using his one good hand to land a final explosive blow, powered with all of his Viltrumite strength and the last of his embers of One for All. As he tears through the body of All for One, Invincible says one last thing. "By the way, your head totally looks like a testicle." Later that night, Mark is sitting outside the hospital, looking up at the stars. He was just visited by his mother and all of Class 1A, those of which that weren't also checked in for medical care following the invasion. They managed to suffer 0 casualties, All for One being the only villain who died, taking the One for All quirk with him. All Might confirmed his embers are completely gone now. They'd have a lot to talk about after a few days' rest, but he told Mark that right now, he could look forward to a very bright future in hero work. As Mark gazes up at the stars, he thinks about all his potential opportunities for tutors, sponsors, and internships. Of course, there's only one person he'd really like to learn from. Just as that thought crosses his mind, he hears a voice from behind him as someone touches down on the ground. "Mark, thank you for keeping this world safe while I was away. Stay frosty."